Okay, so we ended up last time finishing with the Crusades, and now that brings us up to the Reformation. And we're going to have to, of course, go back a little bit and remind ourselves of some of the things that lead up to the Reformation. It just didn't happen, on one day. All of a sudden, this whole change happens. There's lots of stuff in the air. But we've got two things here to start with. First off is this, what I'm calling the fundamental question. And that is simply this: are there traditions that are beyond Scripture that are an essential part of being a Christian? Because many of the things that the church does are not outlined explicitly in Scripture, right? They're based on principles in Scripture. They're things that were in Scripture that are built upon. And the question is, how essential are those added things, those traditions, those developments since the apostles? And that is where much of the difference is going to lie once we get the story there. And the other thing we have here is just a map. And we'll look at a couple of different maps just because you really can't understand what's going on without understanding the map. And this is where we're going to end up by the end of this segment. You've got the green, which are areas that remain Catholic. You have the dark yellow, orange, I guess you'd call it, that will be Lutheran. You have the purple in the middle here that's Reformed, and a little bit here. You've got some Protestant areas in France as well, even though the country is going to remain officially that way. And then eventually you have Anglican here as well, and then Reformed up here. So you can see from there what we'll eventually see is a more or less a north-south split, but we'll talk about how we get to there. So we'll back it up a little bit and start with the reminder that by AD 200, so couple generations after the apostles, we already have the idea of deacon, priest, bishop established in the majority of churches as the mainstream way of organizing church leadership, right? Deacons, lay leaders, you have a priest, and then you have above the priests for a larger area, a bishop. And that basic pattern is going to hold. There's no change in that thought or discussion for 13, 14 centuries. Couple of reminders of things we've already talked about. If you remember, in the 7th century, we had the Irish and Scottish missionaries with their tariff books. When we were talking about monasticism, we talked about them. Those were the manuals that listed the penances that you had to do for a variety of sins. They were very popular with the clergy because, again, much of the clergy is not as educated as they would want to be. This is a great thing for them because it allows them to just look it up, right? What's the penalty for lustful thoughts about your neighbor's wife? Well, let's look that one up. It just simplifies things. But, of course, it is against Augustine's doctrine of grace. And we emphasized 2 weeks ago the weight of St. Augustine. This discussion here is going to be a battle between two things that Augustine advocated. Two of his ideas are going to run into each other, and both sides are going to be champion Augustine, which is ironic, but we'll see where that comes in later. So again, the ideas build over time, over generations, movements and that kind of thing is what we're seeing here. In the 11th century, we saw that shift between abbots and bishops. From the end of the Roman Empire in the West until the 11th century, you have the rise of monasticism. You have abbots as being some of the most powerful churchmen, people that ran monasteries. All right, but by the 11th century, that is going to shift dramatically as the church becomes more organized, as we get more a more structured diocese, where the bishops become more of an administrator than a spiritual leader in many ways. Kings and noblemen, right? These people that are trying to organize their kingdoms into what we would later call nations. Right, you can't really talk about the nation of France or the nation of England until later in their history, right? They're a kingdom first, but eventually they're becoming nations, nation states, and that kind of thing. Bishops are very useful in that. They become very closely aligned with the ruling class. Of course, we also know that many of the bishops are related to kings, to dukes, to earls, to their nobility. And so that means they are, number one, increasingly consumed with administrative tasks, with running the diocese, right? More and more churches, more and more priests, more and more administration. They become just an administrator, and that moves them further and further away from the common people in their diocese. Distance between them and the local priest, distance between them and the local laity, so that you have tension growing between the administration, between the leadership of the church and the local aspect of it. That's the same kind of thing that can happen to any large organization, right? Happens with a corporation, right? You get a corporation spanning the globe. It's got plants and subsidiaries all over the place. The corporate headquarters isn't always going to mesh with whatever's happening in the local setting. And you have that same kind of thing with bishops. And that tension, that disconnect will lead to the disquiet, to the discomfort that Martin Luther is going to see later. We're still a long ways away from that, right? This is the 11th century. We've got centuries to go, but we're seeing a pattern where reform and change is needed, where trouble is on the horizon. So the first thing that we want to note there that's new, that we haven't talked about at all, is the Fourth Lateran Council. This was organized by Pope Innocent III, 1215 AD. And they did a couple of important things. One of the things that they did that will have consequences, of course, is creating procedures to set up inquisitions, to try heretics. A formal organization to say, when we have someone that we think is a heretic, this is how we set up an inquisition, this is how it's run, these are what the penalties are. It's become formalized. All right? That's going to be put to use real quick. The next thing is that the church, and some of these things were necessary reforms that did a lot of good. We obviously know what happens with the Inquisition, right? With the Inquisitions. The Spanish Inquisition gets all the press, but there were ones all over the place. But this next one is important, of course, and they said that every Christian that's not a child should receive the Eucharistic elements at least once a year after confession. Now, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, they're not receiving the Eucharistic elements? What's going on there? And that's actually the way that it ended up being. In practice, very few common people ever took the wine. It was normally reserved for noblemen. The duke or the king would take it on your behalf. And the common people didn't take it. The common people didn't take the bread that often either. So they weren't really participating on a regular basis in something that was supposed to be for everybody all the time. And so you see, once again, there's some more disconnect and more difficulty there. But the Lateran Council decided that you had to do that after confession. Okay, you just can't go in and take communion when you've got all these sins that are still between you and God, which is, of course, what the Apostle Paul says, right? Don't go to the table without being prepared. But in order to make this happen, they needed to talk more about what the communion actually was. What is the Eucharist? They felt the need to educate the common people about what the Eucharist is. And so the council decided to definitively state that Christ's blood and body and blood, in quotations as it were, right? Because they're are truly contained in the sacrament, from which we get, of course, the fancy word that people probably don't know what it means, but they've heard it before, transubstantiation. That in the Eucharist, it is at some point in the service, and we'll get to that exact moment here in a minute, the actual body and blood of Christ. But how does that work, right? Explain that. What does that mean? And for that, they used the terms that Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, right? Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, those three. Aristotle said that every object, everything has both a substance and an accident. The substance is the reality of it, its essence. Its accident is what it feels like, what it tastes like, how much it weighs, right? It's characteristics. And so they used that to say that it still had the accidents of wine and bread, right? It still smelled like bread, it still tasted like bread, it was still liquid like wine, but it became the substance of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ. So they're trying to make an explanation that makes sense in order to say, because people taking it are like, well, it still tastes like bread to me, it still looks like wine to me, what's going on? And so they're using that from Aristotle to try to come up with an explanation as to what's going on here. So the bread and wine are no longer there in substance. They're replaced by the power of God with a divine substance, but the accidents of bread, the accidents of wine remain. And using the word accidents is probably messing with our head in English because we're thinking of something else when we hear the term accident. But it's Aristotelian. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. And then we have one more development that sort of cements this direction that we're going in, and that is the elevation of the host. If you've ever been to a Catholic Mass, you will notice that at a point when the priest is saying the prayers, he will say in Latin, and of course my Latin is a joke, so if anyone's listening that knows Latin, they'll laugh, but that's okay. He says, "Hoc est enim corpus meum," and which is literally, "for this is my body." Okay, quoting Jesus, but in Latin, of course. And at some point in the 12th century, we're not sure where it started, the priest held them up. It's called elevating the host, held up the bread and held up the cup with the wine in it. And that became the high point of the Latin Mass, of the Western Mass. Again, we're not talking about what they're doing in Eastern Orthodox churches, we're talking about what they're doing in the West. And that becomes a big deal because that's the moment, right, at which the substance accidents is occurring. And so now we have something defined definitively by a church council that will later become quite controversial and will be at the heart of what both Luther and Huss and Wycliffe and Calvin and all the others are arguing about. Some will agree, some will disagree, but this is where that really is cemented there in the 13th century. I forgot. I got one more thing connected to it. I didn't write it down on the PowerPoint, but that's okay. In 1264, Pope Urban IV, U-R-B-A-N, Urban IV, is inspired by an Augustinian nun named Juliana, and he establishes a feast day that's entirely focused on the body and blood of Christ. Anybody know what that one's called? The Feast of the Body and Blood? There's a city in Texas named after it, way down in the south. Corpus Christi. Did you know it from the Texas hint?
Yes.
I've been there. Corpus Christi. By the 14th century, so not long after, that became one of the most important feast days of the church. Individual parishes had guilds, lay guilds, the Baker's Guild or the Fisherman's Guild or whatever, that were promoting and maintaining this. And it became a day with big public processions, festivals. To me, the descriptions of it, reading of it, sound like a big block party. Everybody's coming out, everybody's having fun. It's a huge day in the church calendar, and that is Corpus Christi. And so we see this push in the 12th, the 13th century of the Eucharist to the center of the church life, the increase of the focus on the body and blood with the feast day and other things of that nature, and with the push to get people to actually take it, right? Go ahead and do it. And connecting that to confession. Well, we're about to have some issues. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the statistics on heretics. I got my notes jumbled up. from 1249 to 1257. I don't know why they had that year in the literature I read, but that's not very long, right? 8 years. There were 306 penalties handed out by various inquisitions, including 21 people burned at the stake. It's a random, less than 10-year period. You see that this was a serious thing that was happening. And then you have a man like John Wycliffe on the screen, on the scene. And Wycliffe's last name is spelled like 8 different ways, with an E, without an E, with 2 Fs, with 1 F. So pick your spelling, it doesn't really matter. Wycliffe was an Oxford philosopher. During the 1370s, he began to attack the foundations of the contemporary institutions of the church, right? Not the biblical foundations of anything, but the way the church was doing this, the way the church was doing that. He was a vocal critic. And he said something that, again, goes all the way back to the fight that Augustine was having with the Donatists. The true church is made up only of those who are saved, and therefore the visible church cannot be the true church. So Wycliffe takes the opposite position of Augustine. Remember, Augustine said the church is all the people who are trying to be saints, who are working towards being saints because they are being sanctified. Whereas Wycliffe said, no, the true church are those who are already saved. And so we will always have a disconnect between the spiritual church and the physical church. That was one of his criticisms. He said that the biblical authority is greater than that of the church, and he did something that people weren't always keen on. He said the laity ought to read the Bible, which in our day and age is not a controversial statement. It's more like an educational statement, right? Please read the Bible. It's not going to make anybody upset or freak anybody out. But back then, that's controversial. Wycliffe rejected transubstantiation, and the people that agreed with him at Oxford, it divided the university very bitterly in some ways. The people that followed him were given the nickname Lollards. Have you ever heard about the English Lollards? They're people that followed after Wycliffe. He and his followers produced the first complete English translation from the Vulgate. It's not the first Bible in England, but it's the first one in English. Before that, of course, the English language is a fairly new thing in the 14th century. But he and his followers helped put together the first complete English translation from the Latin, not from the Greek. He wasn't a scholar in Greek. He did it straight from the Latin. But it's still a very useful and a very important translation. In 1407, all existing versions of the Bible in English were officially banned by the English church hierarchy. They said anybody that translated the Bible into English, these must be confiscated, destroyed. You can't have these. They were not going to allow the Bible in the vernacular for a variety of reasons. One of which, of course, you're always questioning is they just didn't trust the laity and didn't trust common people to be able to handle these things. Between 1466 and 1522, these are foundational things for the Reformation. You have 22 editions of the Bible in German between 1466 and 1522. You have an Italian edition in 1471, a French in 1473, a Dutch in 1477, Spanish 1478, Czech 1478, Catalan 1492. So you have all of these countries getting the Bible. Somebody is putting an edition out in the language the people can read. Still have a lot of illiteracy, of course, so that's not going to help everybody. But it's getting people reading the Bible in language that they can own. And of course, the printing press makes that possible. All right? Bibles in the vernacular, printed on a printing press and therefore cheap and common, were a necessary precursor to the Reformation. The Reformation would not have happened if this had not laid the seeds a generation before. If people weren't reading the Bible, talking about it, discussing it, comparing it to what they had been taught, to what they knew, to what they saw. So it's a huge step in that direction, and you see people starting to call for changes. One of the ones that you may know less of than John Wycliffe is Jan Hus. A lot of people in English would know him as John Hus, but his name, of course, was not John Hus because he was a Czech. His name is Jan Hus. And he was a dean of philosophy, another person at a university, at Prague University, and he was inspired by Wycliffe. So Wycliffe inspires Huss. We're going to see a chain of people inspired by other people here. He attacked the church, much like Wycliffe, but it was for him connected to the assertion of Czech identity, of not nationalism, but the idea that our culture, our language is important and it matters. And this is a budding thing that's happening in Czech society at that time. He was excommunicated in 1412. In part because he began offering consecrated wine as well as bread to the laity. And this was the first time in centuries that the laity had been offered the wine. He was absolutely devoted to the Eucharist, very different than Wycliffe. Wycliffe attacked it. He said the church has got this thing screwed up and it needs to be reformed greatly. Huss was going in the other direction, saying, no, we need the people to actually be a part of it and take part of it, and everybody should be in on it. They both wanted reform, they just weren't pushing in the same direction. He's excommunicated. In 1415, he came to what's called the Council of Constance. He was promised safe conduct to and from the council by the Holy Roman Emperor, a man named Sigismund. But Sigismund was convinced by one of the church cardinals that was at this, that if you make a promise to a heretic, you don't have to keep it. And so Jan Hus was seized, was condemned, and was burned at the stake. But that only made him a martyr. And it really made things explode in the Czech lands. He became a powerful symbol within that unrest in that area. It showed that the institutional church had no way of dealing constructively with calls for reform. And that's really all that we're seeing here. There were a lot of people, not just Martin Luther, not just Jan Hus or Wycliffe, Spaniards and Italians as well. You don't hear about them, that were calling for reform. Reform this, reform that, not just about the Eucharist, but about a lot of things. And the problem is that the church is really struggling with its authority. How do we allow criticism and debate without anarchy, right? An age-old question. One the church doesn't necessarily have answers to now, but at least we're not burning people at the stake anymore when we disagree with them. So, progress. After the death of Hus, Jan Hus, a man named, and of course these Czech names are fun for us in English, Jan Zalivsky, led an insurrection, an actual insurrection, and 13 Catholic loyalists were thrown from the upper window of a castle. It didn't go well for them because, this is known, and for whatever reason, it's a funky name, as the defenestration of Prague. And it's the first one, because we're going to see in the second one later. It started large-scale looting and destruction of monasteries. This is the first time in the Western Church. Remember, we had the iconoclastic controversy in the East centuries before this, but this is the first time in the West that you have destruction of church property and church art. First time in the history of Christian Western Europe. For the next 2 centuries in Bohemia, there will be intermittent religious warfare. It will become part of the Reformation later on. When the Reformation gets started with Luther, this will get caught up in that, in the 30 Years' War and all of that stuff. But this is where this was begun before, in the 15th century. They found an independent church, an independent Hussite church, named after Jan, of course. They began worshiping in Czech, not in Latin. Of course, that focus on the vernacular. They're known as the Utraquist Church in some ways. The Utraquist, because in Latin, Utraquist means in both kinds, bread and wine, for the people, and that was their sticking point. Eventually, the Utrecht Church mostly reconciled with Rome. Not entirely, but they kind of came with a peace agreement. But the Bohemian Brethren remained apart and never went back. Sometimes they're also called the Moravian Brethren, if you've heard of them. So Wycliffe inspired Jan Hus. Jan Hus inspires the Brethren, and later on we'll remark about how the Moravian Brethren inspired John Wesley. And so American history gets impacted by Wycliffe, Hus, the Brethren, Wesley, like that. You see that these things move in succession. The next person that we need to talk about is Desiderius Erasmus. And don't worry, Martin Luther's the next guy. We're almost to him. Erasmus was a priest, but he was far more an academic. He didn't really care about being a priest. He was a man that cared about books. In 1516, he publishes a Greek New Testament. He basically and we talk about this extensively in my History of the Bible, but we'll do it real quick here. He basically had about 12 contemporary manuscripts that he compiled and made one text out of. He didn't have early ones like Codex Vaticanus or Codex Alexandrinus, but he had what he took. But he made a Greek manuscript and got that printed. And that's important, of course, because that helped people get back to reading the New Testament in the original language, not in a translation or a translation of a translation. Because he believed, and this is, if you're a grammar nerd, then you should cheer Erasmus. He believed that bad grammar leads to bad theology. So, yay for the grammarians, you sad people. He had a point, of course, to an extent, because bad theology certainly does come in many ways from bad reading of the text. He also wanted to end the idea of what he called clerical privilege, the idea that the clergy had knowledge that wasn't available to the laity, that they had special knowledge, that they knew things. And he wanted to peel that stuff away, get rid of much of the superstition that he saw, especially in the common everyday things that the laity were doing. He said, this stuff is not spiritual, it's all outward stuff. We need to get rid of that, get back to the original languages, get back to studying it. He inspired a lot of people, of course, Martin Luther being the most important for our story here, by emphasizing the original languages. He did not, however, later in life, when offered the chance, join Martin Luther. He was an academic first, and the politics, the controversy was not for him. So he said, I'll stay put. But he was extremely influential in getting people to study the Bible in the original languages again. In this case, primarily Greek, but eventually people doing the same with the Old Testament. Most of these controversies, of course, are New Testament controversies. All right. Excuse me, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. In 1511, we'll pick up his story when he arrives at the University of Wittenberg to teach. The man who was the patron of the University of Wittenberg was Friedrich of Saxony. Friedrich of Saxony is one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. We haven't really talked about this, but the Holy Roman Emperor had 7 people that had the power to elect him when someone died. It wasn't hereditary. We've got a bunch of Habsburgs in a row because they're the most powerful and the most wealthy and the most influence. But these 7 guys have a lot of power, and Friedrich is one of them. He will be opposed to the emperor at some point, and one of the reasons, why didn't the emperor just, crush him? He's one of the 7 electors. It's an important role that he owns. He is going to be the patron of the university, and he will become Luther's protector. He will be the one that keeps Luther from ending up on a stake. In 1515, Martin Luther was lecturing on Romans, and he was there strongly influenced by reading St. Augustine. He rejected the interpretation that was common in the church of the day, that of Thomas Aquinas. We didn't have time to talk about Thomas Aquinas, but we probably should have made the time at some point. It's just I can't make time for everything. Thomas Aquinas was the primary theologian that people in this time period are reading and using his interpretations. But Luther goes back beyond him to Augustine and says, no, Augustine has got the right understanding of Romans here. And there's a story in and of itself that goes into the Greek versus the Latin. The crux of the situation is that he was reading Romans 1:17. He who through faith is righteous shall live is one English translation of that. The Vulgate's Latin uses the word justitia, related to justice and justification. The idea of making someone righteous, of being righteous. Whereas the Greek, dikaios, is being declared righteous. It's a subtle difference, and if you're not a grammarian, if you're not a theologian, you might not, right, what's the difference? We're talking about getting justice. But for Martin Luther, this subtle distinction between the Latin and the Greek, as he was studying the text of Romans, as he was studying Augustine, was a huge thing for him. Because even though he was a monk, right, even though he dedicated his life to the church, Martin Luther still felt guilt, as people do when they make mistakes, when they sin, right? And so he felt unworthy of the presence of God. He felt fearful of the justice of God and the wrath of God. He saw law, Old Testament law, and gospel as the same thing. And when he realized that faith was the key to receiving the righteousness of God, not our righteousness, but God's righteousness, that he didn't need his own, as he had previously understood Romans to be talking about, he said this, I was born again of the Holy Ghost, and the door of paradise swung open and I walked through. So this is a man dedicated to the church, but he felt no peace because of the way he understood righteousness as something for him to achieve, not something to be given to him. And so for, of course, Martin Luther, this is a massive turning point, this teaching of Romans that he was doing. Which brings us to an important question of what's going on at the same time. Right, the same time Martin Luther is having this personal revelation, which might have ended there if other things hadn't been going on. You have Pope Leo X raising money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, a beautiful church. They needed money to rebuild it. So far, no big deal, right? Church building fund. However, the way that Pope Leo went about it was by selling indulgences. And they had a campaign, particularly in Germany, in the areas around which Luther was living, that was very, very in your face, very, very bold. The bishop there and the cardinals there selling these indulgences. And of course, we talked about indulgences when we saw the Crusades, right? If you go on crusade, you earn an indulgence. This is a development of that. Now you don't have to go on crusade, you just have to give the church money. And then you can have your sins forgiven. But Martin Luther said, what are you paying for? What are you actually paying for? Because the blood of Christ was supposed to have paid for your sins, so what are you paying for? And these indulgences bothered him greatly. He could not square the practice of selling indulgences with what he believed from Romans, what he saw from St. Augustine about grace. And so very famously, it's October 28th, we're almost a couple days, we had the 500th anniversary last year. On October 31st, 1517, Luther, saying that these indulgences are no good, posted his 95 thesis. It's his 95 objections, his questions. He did, as far as we can tell, of course, there's so much legend surrounding this. He went to the parish church in Wittenberg, and like other people did, he nailed his debate request to the door of the church and said basically, who wants to debate me on this stuff? That's all he was asking. Please debate me. This is not the most subversive thing anybody ever did, right? Ask for a debate. But that's what he did. He wanted to talk about grace. The church, in response, will defend its authority, right? Who has the right to make decisions? Who has the right to be the one in charge here? And they will say what you need to do is obey the church, not raise these objections. A man named Cardinal Cajetan is the one that pushes Luther toward rebellion, and he is prioritizing what St. Augustine said about the authority of the church. But Luther is prioritizing what St. Augustine said about grace. That you can quote St. Augustine and both be saying, see, this is ancient father of the church. We're both quoting him. But that's a problem, of course, because these two ideas are banging up against each other. In 1519, a man named Johann Eck will debate Martin Luther. And Martin Luther will say something that pushes this forward. He says, I'm sure of this, many of Huss's beliefs, Jan Hus, were completely evangelical and Christian. Remember, Jan Hus was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. Martin Luther says, you know what? I think most of what he had to say was right. That's going to ruffle some feathers. In 1520, Martin Luther is excommunicated. And he will publicly take the papal bull, that the piece of paper that says that he was excommunicated, to the university grounds in Wittenberg, and in a public moment with all the students cheering him on, he will burn it. All right, dramatic, definitely. And he will then publish some really strong anti-papal tracts. That's not what Luther started out doing, right? He wasn't saying anything about the papacy. He was talking about indulgences. He was talking about grace. Now he's going to publish a tract called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. That the church is in Babylon. We are not in Jerusalem anymore. That's a much stronger position than what he had started with. And had he not been pushed in that direction, he wouldn't have gone there. Had they said, let's debate, let's have a council, let's talk about this. All right, it's fascinating, a what if of what the church might have been had this not gone this way. Because Martin Luther was not a firebrand. He was not a my way or the highway kind of guy, at least not in his early years. So, Martin Luther is going to come up with what is in his mind a compromise, and that's going to be his new position. He will maintain that it is really the body and blood of Christ at the Eucharist, all right? But he will reject the idea that it is a repetition of the sacrifice of Christ, that it's perpetual propitiation. That's a lot of P's when you got a bad voice. And so it's a subtle distinction for some, but it's the difference between Lutheranism and Catholicism regarding the Eucharist. They both believe that it is really the body and blood of Christ. One believes that it's a repetition, and one believes that it's a symbol, but a real symbol. And so, again, he's not going that far from where he started. And in calmer times, he might have been able to stay. In 1519, so we have to back up a couple of years, Charles V was elected the Holy Roman Emperor, and Charles V will control the largest empire in the history of the Western Church. All right, he's a Habsburg. He controls Spain. He controls the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland. He controls territory in Italy. He controls territory in the New World. He's the most powerful ruler since the Roman emperors. This man is massive in terms of his armies, his money, his authority, his lands, all of that stuff. And that, of course, will be significant. They will have a hearing at a city called Worms, or as Americans call it, Worms. At this hearing, in April 1521, Luther will be asked to recant. They will read some of his most controversial remarks from his tracts and say, will you take that back? And Luther will respond, and I've got sort of the whole quote here. The thing that he's reported to have said that kind of becomes the poster is, here I stand, I can do no other. And that's awesome. But he probably didn't really say that. It's a little too pithy, a little bit too perfect. But the sentiment is exactly what he meant. But here is his direct quote. Unless I'm convinced by the testimony of the scriptures or by clear reason. He gave two possibilities, right? For I don't trust either in the Pope or the councils by themselves, since it's well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves. I am bound by the scriptures I've quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. That phrase has become, of course, famous. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it's neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me, amen. So that itself is a powerful statement. It's just not as quick and easy to remember as his one sentence line there. I don't care if people say he said, here I stand, I can do no other. We just don't have proof, contemporary proof that he said it. He might have. But it sounds like something that a biographer said, you know what, that's the right line. So he refuses to recant. And this is an important moment in the history of not just the church, but of Western society. Because this is basically the first momentous example of an individual person in the West who successfully defies society on the basis of their own convictions and principles. In other words, this is the birth of individualism. For better or for worse, this is the beginning of people saying, I as an individual will go by my convictions and my principles, even if society tells me I'm wrong. Up until this point, you just don't see people doing that. There's so much of a cultural and societal pressure to be a part, which is in many ways good, right? We don't want people going off on the deep end all by themselves. And individualism hasn't always worked out that well for humanity. But Martin Luther is the one that you go back and say, where did individualism start in Western society? It was right here at this moment. Because he said, all of the church can say I'm wrong, but if I think this is what the scriptures say, then I'll be by myself. And that's, of course, a crazy, bold statement. That other people, it's not far, it didn't so much work for Jan Hus, right? I mean, he might have had the same idea, but since they burned him at the stake, Luther's the first one who was able to pull it off and live to tell the tale. In this case, Charles V protects Martin Luther and honors his safe conduct. Remember, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund had Jan Hus burned at the stake. Charles V, for all of his other issues, didn't lie, and he let Luther go. Now, they snuck Luther out before the finale of the thing after he refused to recant. He kind of left before they could condemn him, and they ended up condemning him in absentia. Friedrich becomes his protector. They sneak him back to a castle where he translates the Bible into German and writes a hymn you might have heard of. A mighty fortress is our God, right? Might have heard of that, our English version of it. That is when he wrote that. In 1525, contrary to what Luther wanted, peasants took his defiance of authority as a signal that the end, they really did believe that the end times were upon us. And so now is the time to revolt against our feudal overlords and throw off their tyranny and all that kind of power to the people stuff. And they arose in bloody revolt. It's known as the Peasants' War, but it was brutally crushed by the professional soldiers. And Luther was horrified that his call for reform had led to rebellion. And he sided with the nobles. So the people that thought Luther's with us, no. He wasn't that kind of rebel. That was not his thing. All right, why did Friedrich of Saxony protect Luther? and this will become the question very much associated with the 30 Years' War here in a minute. Remember I said that nobody has been as powerful as Charles V since the Roman emperors. His fellow monarchs were scared to death of him. They believed that he was going to take over everything. The French kings, the English kings, the Scandinavian kings, the German princes, even the Pope was afraid of Charles V. All right, so he was protected not so much out of principle, not so much out of theology, but out of self-interest as a weapon to be used against Charles V. All right, what happens next? So now we've got a budding movement of Lutherans, right? The Lutheranism starting in Germany. In the 1520s, a new movement starts in Zurich, Switzerland. A man named Zwingli, who you might not know much about. Zwingli was a parish priest, and they decided in Zurich, and this was a novel idea, that the city council would decide church law based on Scripture. It would make our city council meetings a little more interesting here. Some of us might go and pay attention and vote for city councilmen and all that and run for those positions if they were the ones deciding church law for us. That would be an interesting way of going about things. This is the beginning of what we called the Reformed Christianity, the Reformed movement. And they differ from Martin Luther in three very key ways. Number one, they were not a fan of images. They systematically removed from all of the churches statues, art, all of that stuff. They were iconophobic. To go back to that last debate, Martin Luther didn't have an issue with with statues, with art. They looked at the law as a positive thing. You know, Luther was like, man, law and grace, they're separate. But the Reformed, because they believed that they were the new Israel, they believed that they had taken over the promises of God to Israel and the church had inherited them, they saw the law in a much more positive light. And then thirdly, and perhaps most influential, or most importantly for what's going to happen next, they rejected sacramentalism. No sacramentalism in the Eucharist, no sacramentalism in baptism. They're not sacraments, they said. All right, Martin Luther is keeping baptism as a sacrament. Martin Luther is keeping Eucharist as a sacrament. He's just explaining it a little bit different. All right, so, you know, if you go to a Lutheran church, an Episcopal church, an Anglican church, a Catholic church, and you don't really know what's going on, not a lot of difference in how it unfolds, right? There's a lot of similarity. You go to a Reformed church and you're dealing with a whole different thing. All right, so they were much more radically changing the way things were being done than Martin Luther. The reason I know it's radical is because eventually, later in life, Martin Luther would decide that the Zwinglians, that was the term at the time, the Reformed, were more in error than the Pope. So he said, you all have gone off way too far, and I don't want a piece of that. So just because they were both reformers doesn't mean that Luther and Zwingli and the people that came in his footsteps were seeing things the same way. Oh, and here we get, before I read this one, in 1529, when German princes at the Imperial Diet, the Imperial Congress, were defending Martin Luther, they were accused of protesting. And so they were called Protestants. That's where it comes from a political debate at the Holy Roman Empire's imperial government. In 1530, Luther's supporters will give Charles V a statement of doctrine produced by a man named Philip Melanchthon, and he's a huge helper of Martin Luther. He's a big person in the Reformation. We just don't have time to go into him. Something called the Augsburg Confession. And if you're a Lutheran, that's kind of the official statement of what we believe as a Lutheran. However, the story didn't end, because once you start a ball rolling, it kind of keeps going on its own, right? It's got momentum. We only got 2 more slides on this one, and then my voice needs a moment. Some people in Zurich said, you know what, Zwingli, you're on the right track by saying these aren't sacraments, but you're not going that far enough. All right? If baptism and communion are not sacraments, they're really pledges of faith by those who believe, then why is baptism being done on infants? That was their idea. And they said what baptism ought to be is for people who have confessed. They call it believer's baptism. And they said it ought to be for adults. Well, they were called by their enemies anabaptists, because anabaptist means re-baptizer. Because of course all the people they were baptizing as adults had been baptized as children, so it was a second baptism for them. And Zwingli, you see a pattern, was appalled. So Luther was appalled when people went further than he wanted. Zwingli was appalled when people went further than he wanted. But that's just the way reform and revolution works. The church, Zwingli said, is the whole city of Zurich. If you as an adult can opt out and choose not to be baptized, we'll have a divided community. We won't all be the church. And so they persecuted the Anabaptists in Zurich. And for whatever reason, they went a different direction. They didn't burn them at the stake, they drowned them in the river. And they drowned 4 of them. I guess it was probably related to the whole baptism thing, right? If you want to go back in the water, let's see how you do underwater. Kind of. Apparently somebody thought that was funny. And they basically so you're thinking, okay, it wasn't just the Catholic Inquisition that was killing people. The Reformed, the Lutherans, everybody had a hand in this. It was pretty much what people were doing. The Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Reformed all shared the conviction that all of society are part of the church if you're in Christendom. Everybody is a part of the church, whether you want to be or not, whether you act like it or not, you're in. So they all held to the idea of baptizing infants, because then you're officially in, everybody's in. Whereas the Anabaptists were saying, you don't have to be in. All right, again, this goes all the way back, right? This is the same argument that Augustine was having with the Donatists. Is everybody in or not? What about the people that don't act like they're in, right? And so, we're fast forwarding 1,000 years, but we're still arguing about the same thing. Nobody liked the Anabaptists. The Catholics hated them, the Lutherans hated them, the Reformed hated them. So, yay, right? And that's why I said Anabaptists were nobody's friends, because they literally had few friends. The map shows where they had areas of influence. They never were a majority anywhere. They were a minority everywhere they were. Of course, they are the most radical group, right? The ones pushing things further than anybody else. So what is the end result of the generation of Martin Luther? We have Europe divided roughly north-south and roughly along pre-existing geographical and cultural boundaries. Language boundaries, right? The Swiss Alps, the Pyrenees, these are the kinds of boundaries that already existed, and they were the ones at which many of these lines were drawn in the Reformation. After this first generation, you have Germany and Scandinavia is Lutheran, right? You have Switzerland and Holland a little bit later that become Reformed. You have Poland and France kind of on the sides, remaining Catholic, although France has a huge Protestant minority. They're going to have to deal with that. But you have Spain and Austria and Italy, of course, remaining Catholic. So it's much north-south. Eventually, England will sort of switch sides, depending on how you view the Anglicans under Henry VIII in 1534. One last thing in this section before we look at the map and call it to a close, and that is what's called the Battle of Mohawks, which you probably haven't heard of, and that's okay because it's not well known. In 1526, the Ottoman Empire in the southeast, we can skip ahead to that, over in here, had a huge battle, and they crushed the Christian army that was facing them. The Holy Roman Emperor's brother-in-law, King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, was killed in battle. 5 bishops and 2 archbishops died in the battle. It was a slaughter. You get the point, right? It was a huge blow to those that were defending the old way of doing things, right? The status quo. And it showed that the Ottoman Empire was an existential threat to Christianity, to Christendom from the outside at the moment when Christendom was divided in ways that had never been divided before, right? More divided, more vulnerable, more threatened. And this is a reminder that we're not getting along, but there are other people out there that don't have a problem with taking advantage of that. And so that is the status at the end of the Reformation. Again, you have Catholicism mostly in the south. You've got the Reformed here and here in the middle. And then, of course, you got the Moravians and the Hussites over here. The Lutherans in this area. The Anglicans in the south, more Reformed eventually in Scotland. And then you've got the Ottomans down here. The Muslims still there. So we've got a divided continent in every which way, and this map is a mess. So let's pause for a moment at the end of talking about the Reformation, because the 30 Years' War is more of a mess and more complicated. So let's pause and see if there's any questions while I drink some water. Tick, 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 tick. All right.
What percentage would you guess could read back in these times? One out of 100, 1 out of 5?
No, it wasn't quite that bad. Reliable statistics of the medieval period are horrible to find. It wouldn't have been 1 out of 100. It would have been higher than that. But probably maybe at the most 20%, 15, 20%, because you're starting to get a period where a lot of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, need to read for business, right? For trade and whatnot. And it would have been a more rudimentary kind of reading and education. But the era of government-run, public education for everybody is still a ways away. So we're getting there, and books are more plentiful than ever before, which of course was a huge thing here. All right, the 30 Years' War. This is a mess of a map. This map is such a mess that it won't matter to you that this map is in German, because it wouldn't have been easier for you to tell what's what if all it was in English. I couldn't find a good one in English. This is a German map of the Holy Roman Empire. All right, so this is the territory that Charles V controls, in addition to Spain, the Low Countries, the New World, right? He is technically the ruler of all of this. Basically from the Baltic to the Adriatic in the center of Europe. Now, he's the feudal lord, right? He doesn't technically own all of that. He owns bits and pieces of it. And other local princes, other local rulers, and it's a massive mess of patchwork, all right? This is why Germany was not united as a nation until much later than France or Spain or England, because this is a crazy bit of loyalty. You got to get right on top of that map just to even see the different colors, right? And so you add to that some of these territories are now Lutheran, some of them are Reformed, some of them remain Catholic, some of them have an Anabaptist minority, some of them are, and many of them are mixed, right? 60-40, 50-50. And you have a recipe for a mess. And of course, that mess is 30 years of war. All right, so the question after the generation of Martin Luther, because he's going to die in 1546, is, will Protestantism survive the counterattack? The Council of Trent begins in 1545. It's known as the Counter-Reformation. It was the answer of Catholicism to what had happened with Luther and the Reformed. How do we get back and shore this thing up? In 1547, the year after Luther died, and this is a fun one, the Schmalkaldic League, right? You pronounce that. That's a fun word. Was defeated by the Holy Roman Emperor. That was a group of Protestant, of Lutheran, German princes that banded together to fight against Charles V, but they were crushed. And after that, we have what is known as, I'm jumping down to the Peace of Augsburg. Sorry, I got to find where I left with that. Which decided after this victory that within the Holy Roman Empire, a territory would follow the faith of their ruler. If the ruler was Catholic, the territory was Catholic. If the ruler was Lutheran, the territory was Lutheran. They didn't mention the Reformed. Like, I don't see you, you don't exist, we'll pretend you're not real. And so it was kind of a momentary breathing spot of peace. And territories are going to go back and forth with whoever happens to be ruling right now, right? You get a marriage, the territory changes hands, et cetera, et cetera. New guy comes to power after his dad, changes sides. And it's an odd way of taking a look at that. But at this point, there's no necessary proof that Protestantism will survive as anything more than a footnote. Because it looks like the Holy Roman Emperor is going to be able to crush anyone that really does stand up to him. Until you have the reforms of John Calvin. We already had the Reformed established under Zwingli in Zurich. In Geneva, Switzerland, you have John Calvin. He's a Frenchman, but he was exiled from France. He establishes a system of church government by, and you gotta love this, by committee. Everybody cheer for committees, right? How many church committees does your church have? Most churches have a lot of committees. You can thank John Calvin, either gleefully or muttering. He called them, of course, presbyteries. And so this is the beginning of what will become the Presbyterian Church. In 1536, he published what's called the Institutes of Christian Religion. It was a massive tome of his theological understanding of things. He emphasized human depravity, right up there with St. Augustine. But he also spent a lot of time talking about predestination. The idea that not only does God pick the elect, but he also consigns everyone else to hell. Probably the most controversial thing that Calvin and Calvinism says, but that was his understanding. So Calvin and other reformers tried to reconcile Lutheranism and Reformed, right? They said to themselves, if we are divided, the Catholics are going to crush us. So we got to come to an understanding. We got to have peace. Didn't work. The Lutherans were basically like, it ain't happening. We're not bending. You guys are too nuts. We don't want any of that. In 1563, the Reformed published what is known as the Heidelberg Catechism. That was their attempt to try to get as many Protestants as they could to sign on to a common confession. But it has in it things that the Lutherans could not accept about the Eucharist, that it's only a symbol and not the body and blood of Christ. The Lutherans said, forget it. And the Lutherans said that baptism is still a sacrament. And so, no, it was too far for the Lutherans, and it wasn't far enough for the Anabaptists. So we're not going to have any unity on the Protestant side. I know we talk about Protestants like it's a thing, but especially at this point, these are separate things going kind of their own direction. The church history book that I based much of my notes on says this: Reformed Christianity saved the Reformation from its mid-century phase of hesitation and disappointment. That author gives a lot of credit to John Calvin and those that followed him for giving a new push, a new emphasis, a new life to the Protestant movement. All right, what's going on before the war starts? In France, you have the Protestants being a challenge to the monarchy, and the monarchy responds with basically 50 years of fighting against the Huguenots. In 1572, you've heard of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. They basically, over time, wiped out the power of the Protestants in France. In Scotland, you have reform activists that toss Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, off the throne, and they establish an official Scottish Presbyterian church. So they reformed our leg up there in Scotland. In the Netherlands, after a long fight, the Habsburgs, the Catholics, are thrown out, and a Dutch Reformed church is established. So that was a kind of combination of a religious thing and a national independence thing, because they obviously didn't like being ruled from Spain, where the Habsburgs were based. And then in England, remember Henry started them on a path of reform. Elizabeth, when she comes to the throne, says we're basically stopping right where we are. Okay? We're not going to go any further in Reformation. We're not going to go back towards Catholicism. We're going to stay here. And for want of a better way to describe it, she basically stopped the Anglican Church about halfway between the two. People in England, not everybody was on board with that, and some people said, no, keep going, keep going. They called them the Puritans. They agitated and said, we need to keep going, we need to keep going. All right, so the war is about to start. The north-south split is deep. The battle lines are drawn, but we have two battles to talk about first, and one remarkable moment outside of the story that I just want to highlight for you. In 1568, the Transylvanian Diet, so the Congress in Transylvania, and this is a territory that has the Ottomans to the south, the Habsburgs to the west, and the Russians to the east. They got no friends. They're like Poland, right? Good luck. They passed a remarkable thing, a remarkable edict, and it says this: ministers should everywhere preach and proclaim the gospel according to their understanding of it, and if their community is willing to accept this, good. If not, however, no one should be compelled by force if their spirit is not at peace. No one is permitted to threaten to imprison or banish anyone because of their teaching, because faith is a gift from God. In Transylvania, they decided, and it didn't last, of course, very long, but at least for a generation or two, that we weren't going to use force to solve any of this. If people disagreed, they're free to disagree. Now, everybody else is getting their army ready. Everybody else is planning for war. But one little group said, you know what, can't we all just get along? Interesting to see that somebody in the 16th century was thinking that, but it's one voice, right? It's a small voice compared to what everybody else is saying. Oops, I didn't talk about these. In 1571, the Battle of Lepanto in the Adriatic, Don Juan of Austria, who happened to be the illegitimate son of Charles V, he led a coalition Catholic fleet in the Adriatic, and they crushed the Turks in a huge naval battle. It basically stopped the Ottomans from expanding further west in the Mediterranean for generations, and took away that threat from the east. Okay, remember the Battle of Mohawks made that threat very real. The Battle of Lepanto sort of put it on hold for a while, which allows this fight between Catholic and Protestant to heat up, because you're not worried about those guys anymore for a while. And then in 1588, you have the one that I know you know about, the Spanish Armada, right? The Spaniards, the Habsburgs, try to invade England and bring them back into the Catholic side by force, but a little bit of weather and a little bit of seamanship, and the English win. All right. In 1618, things start up again in Prague. Those crazy people in Prague, right? They started it a while ago. They're pushing it again. This is what's called the Second Defenestration of Prague. This time, when they threw people out the window, they put a cart with hay at the bottom, so they didn't splat and die. They just humiliated them. So you called it better, right? I mean, why did it happen? Well, the Bohemian Hussites, right? The Utrecht church had been pushed by the Habsburgs for some time, one little bit at a time, a new imperial edict, a new decision, pushing Catholicism back into the Bohemian lands. And they were not having any of that. They got upset and said, okay, that's enough. We're not putting up with your attempts. And they remember that there is no king of Bohemia, and they elect Friedrich V as their next king. Friedrich V was already the Elector Palatine. He controlled a little territory in that map in the middle, which meant he had a vote for Holy Roman Emperor. But the king of Bohemia also had a vote. So it meant that Friedrich now had 2 out of the 7 votes, made him a very powerful man, made him an extreme rival of the Holy Roman Emperor, who's not going to let that last. All right? In 1620, then you have the Battle of White Mountain. Ferdinand, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles is now dead, destroys Friedrich's army. The interesting thing is that despite Friedrich's call for help, right, fellow Lutherans, fellow Protestants, help me, nobody else showed up to help him. It was basically, Friedrich and his few against the entire army that Ferdinand could put together, and they got massacred. Friedrich goes into exile, and he loses both of his thrones. He had 2 votes, now he's got none. And the Habsburgs begin to revoke all the rights that the Hussites had and put the Catholic Church back into Austria and into Bohemia. At this point, when this happened, 90% of the people in Bohemia were non-Catholic in 1619. But now you don't think of Austria, Bohemia, Hungary as anything other than Catholic land, because it got completely reversed. In 1622, Heidelberg is sacked. And the elector, another one of the guys with a vote, his library was ransacked. He had one of the world's best libraries. That entire library was taken to the Vatican, and it's still there. I'm surprised that German, nationalists and German whatnots have not agitated for the return of his books out of a national pride kind of thing. That's what people are doing these days, right? Sending stuff back that's been looted. But it's still there. I've been to the Heidelberg, the ruins of the Heidelberg Castle. And so we've got another victory of the Catholic forces, which leads to 1629. One of the things that you keep seeing in history is that when somebody has a victory, they overreach. They go too far, right? Napoleon invading Russia, Hitler invading Russia. Mostly it's invading Russia. But people just can't leave well enough alone and stop. And that's exactly what Ferdinand did. He passes what's known as the Edict of Restitution. Basically, he says all of the things that belong to the church in my territory, in the Holy Roman Empire, have to go back. All right? He also destroyed the Hussite church. It had been a church for 200 years, and it will basically disappear. The only Western European church to ever disappear is the Hussite church. The Moravian Brethren are still survive, but this official Hussite church, boom, wiped off the map. The edict was a disaster because moderate Catholics were terrified. If Ferdinand has the power to do this, what will he do next? Friedrich had Lutheran allies, and they said, no, that's too far. All right, he was going back beyond the Peace of Augsburg and saying, we're going to rewrite even the old things and make everything the way it was before the Reformation, basically, in my land. And that freaked people out. I lost my spot. The French Catholics were alarmed. They said, this isn't good. He's got too much power. Even the Lutheran Swedes were alarmed. Everybody starts to see that the Habsburgs are aiming for hegemony, right? They want to control all of Europe, and so they have to be stopped. It's Napoleon stuff just 2 centuries earlier. In 1630 then, the Swedish king, a man named Adolphus or Adolf, brings his army south out of Scandinavia to fight. And fortunately for the Protestants, he was a brilliant general. And he had some massive victories. If he hadn't died young, he might have turned things even more. But him coming and winning meant that this fight became a continent-wide fight. It wasn't just a dispute within the Holy Roman Empire before, because the Swedes are not part of it. He's getting involved, all right? And that's going to bring the French in. It's going to bring the Dutch in. It's going to bring everybody in, and it's going to become an entire war and not just a fight. In 1631, and this is one of those moments that deserves to be mentioned, the city of Magdeburg. It was an imperial free city. Within the Holy Roman Empire, there were certain cities that were independent. They didn't own anything to any feudal lord. Their own town council ran things. A certain number of cities had this. It was an ancient right. It was very well regarded, very, very sacred to them. The city of Magdeburg, over 20,000 people in it, was ransacked by an army after it fell under siege, and virtually all of the people there were killed. Rape, pillage, plunder, fire. It was a massacre of epic proportions. And it was a wake-up call, again, to the Protestants saying, if we don't fight together, if we don't get this figured out, this is what's going to happen to us. People considered this to be a biblical disaster, like the fall of Jerusalem kind of thing, just because of how shocking it was. No free city within the Holy Roman Empire had ever suffered a fate like this through all of the years until this happened. So France will join the fight after 1629 because they say we need to stop the Habsburgs. You'll know the name of the guy that was behind that policy, a man named Cardinal Richelieu. Anybody read Three Musketeers? Right? Cardinal Richelieu is the villain, for the most part, of Alexander Dumas' novels. But Richelieu, a Catholic cardinal, was the one pushing the King of France to fight against the Habsburgs. It wasn't about religion, it was about being terrified of the Habsburgs. If we don't help the Protestants now, they'll come for us eventually, kind of thing. Even Pope Urban VIII was said to have said prayers after Protestant victories of Thanksgiving, because he was terrified of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor too, even though they were on the same side. Remember, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope haven't always been on the same side of anything, right? Okay. Eventually, in 1643 to 1648, you have what's known as the Peace of Westphalia. It took them 5 years to come up with a peace solution for a very good reason. The Allies on the anti-Habsburg side, right, that's the Habsburgs versus everybody, the anti-Habsburg side had a lot of different goals. The Swedes had one goal, the French had a goal, the English had a goal, the Dutch had a goal, right? Everybody had different goals. So how do we decide to make one treaty? It was very difficult. Eventually, they all decided that 1624 was a good time to freeze the map of Europe. In 1624, neither side was winning. It was pretty 50-50. So whoever owned what in 1624, that's what it goes back to. Kind of weird, but that's the way they decided it. It cemented the idea that many of the Habsburg lands in Central Europe would continue to be Protestant. The Edict of Restitution, the thing that pushed people into all-out war, was completely undone by the Peace of Westphalia. It was a bridge too far. It was an overreach by Ferdinand, and it made him a whole bunch of new enemies. Plus, in the Peace of Westphalia, someone said, well, we ought to include the Reformed in this. They've been around a while, not the Anabaptists, shh, forget about them. But at least now it's Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed all have a right to exist. Before this 30 years of war, people didn't really think that the Holy Roman Empire would ever end. It was a weird thing. It was a mishmash thing. It wasn't. It was odd, but it seemed like a permanent thing. After the war, everybody could tell that this would never be coherent. It would never be unified, because it's now split between Lutheran, Reformed, and Catholic pieces. How will they ever coalesce? They never would, and they never did. Eventually, just by saying so, Napoleon in 1806 will say, oh, by the way, that thing's done. Because he basically conquered all of its territory. He said, yeah, we don't need a new Holy Roman Emperor. We're done with that. Last thoughts on the war, and this is basically the end result. It's not as much a mess as the previous map, at least, but this tells you the territories. You've got Catholic. Here in the middle is here's the Lutheran up here, Reformed, and then this. You got a lot of areas that are mixed with minorities. So anyway, it's still a mess, but it's not quite as much as it was before. You're thinking, what on earth did all of that accomplish? The answer is not much. What was the cost? The cost was massive. The only country that didn't get involved were the Russians. They're Orthodox. They didn't have a dog in the fight. They stayed out of it. Everybody else was a part. It started with religion, but it really wasn't about religion. It was about power. It was about worry about Habsburg hegemony. But religion made people do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, atrocities and whatnot. After 1648, most Christian rulers decided that this crusade thing is done. It doesn't work. A lot of people get killed, but it doesn't change people's minds, which of course is a good conclusion for them. And rulers no longer, after the Peace of Westphalia, were allowed to determine whether their subjects were going to be Catholic, Protestant, or Lutheran, or Reformed. It wasn't up to them anymore, and that's a good thing. If you want to study the 30 Years' War as a researcher, you have to go to libraries scattered all over the continent of Europe, because there's about 1 million pages of records, and they're written in 14 languages. That's one of the reasons why most people don't know about the 30 Years' War, because it's so darn complicated. Just trying to keep track of who's who and who's fighting who and who's on what side is insane. It's like reading War and Peace. You need a chart. What was the cost of the war? This might shock you. The intensity and scope of the fighting varied greatly from time to time and place to place. It wasn't a continuous fighting like World War I, right, where you had a front and the fighting just kept going and going. It came and went. But the average total population loss, the average loss from 16 to 18 to 1648 was 15 to 20%. You need some perspective, don't you? The Russians in World War II, the Russians only lost 12%. And we consider that to be one of the most horrific losses of life in any war. In World War I, the average loss was 5%. In World War II, the average loss was 6%. But the average loss in the 30 Years' War was 15 to 20%. Some areas actually saw a net gain in their population in those 30 years because of refugees fleeing there, and then there wasn't much fighting there. Some areas saw a population decline of 50 to 75%, either dead or fleed. So basically places, devoid of life, whole villages wiped out, people fleeing like crazy. It was insane. About 450,000 soldiers were killed, which for back then was a lot less than the American Civil War. But again, there's less people, so it's a higher percentage. Disease, of course, killed far more. There were plague outbreaks again and again and again because of course, war leads to plague. So it's basically the most destructive war in the history of Europe. And most people couldn't tell you anything about it other than how long it lasted because it's baked right into the title. That's a cheat. But you all know that. All right. Questions about the 30 Years' War. We're pushing on our time, but we've got 2 short ones to finish up with. So if we had a quiz, right? Who's on what side and who's fighting who? You all good to go? Of course not. It is completely crazy how complicated it was. So let's finish on a more positive note. Talk about the missions movement, the modern worldwide missions movement. And we'll start by talking about the New World and talking about the Spanish and the Portuguese. You're familiar with their overseas colonies and their conquests after 1492. The Spanish primarily in Central and South America, the Portuguese primarily in Africa and around to India and whatnot. Prior to Columbus's discovery, Christianity didn't have anywhere to expand to, right? You've got the Scandinavians, they're Christians now. You've got the Slavs, they're Christians now. You've got Islam to the south and the southeast. That ain't an easy way to go, right? You can't exactly send missionaries into their land. And of course, they've got an army and they're an existential threat and all of that. So there's really nowhere to go. The discovery of the New World changes everybody's imagination about that and gives people, of course, not just economic ideas, but missions ideas as well. The Catholic Christianity of Spain and Portugal will then spread rapidly to their colonies, along with their conquistadors, along with their traders, G-R-A-I-T, along with the people trading. You have, of course, priests and missionaries. Pope Julius II will grant the Spanish what's called a patronato, which means they have the exclusive right to preach the gospel within their territory. He regretted that later because it gave the Spaniards too much power. They gave the Portuguese the same right. Of course, this in the Spanish lands was done by conquest. You got Cortez with the Aztecs, Pizarro with the Incas, and basically they saw it as a continuation of the Reconquista, right? The reconquest of Spain that they had done from the Moors. They basically said, we're just doing the same thing. It's basically a kind of crusade in Central and South America. And so the missionaries went with the army. They were connected to it. But already by 1500, you have some Franciscan and Dominican monks in the Americas who are protesting that the natives are being treated in an unchristian manner. A man named Bartolomé de las Casas was a plantation owner who will hear a sermon by a Dominican monk and will have a conversion experience, himself become a Dominican monk, and say this: Jesus had not intended conversion to his joyful tidings to be a matter of arms and bombardments, but of reason and human persuasion. So you have, even in the 1500s, some saying that this way of doing mission work at the point of the gun is not the Christian way. They are, of course, the minority. They're not very much being listened to, but it's important to remember that somebody was going against that. But despite those objections, basically the story of Christian mission in Central and South America is also a story of military force. You can't separate the two. By 1550, you have 10 million baptized Americans, people living in the Americas, 10 million. But you also have, of course, half of the people that were there when the white men came that were dead because of disease, smallpox and whatnot. So it is a complicated story in the New World. you could call it, in a sense, advancement of the gospel, but also at the same time a dark time for the gospel. It's a very difficult thing to talk about and to try to figure out. They had a couple of issues, of course. Number one, priestly celibacy was an issue because the American Indians were like, celibacy? Dude, what? Right? They never heard of that idea. That was crazy to them. And they insisted that of course, the service be in Latin, which is a little hard in the Americas. And they barred locals from being priests for many generations. So it's a fit and start kind of thing, and there's some issues going on there. In Africa and Asia, however, the story is, of course, very different because you don't have military conquest. So the missionaries are basically on their own, right? Also, in Africa and Asia, the missionaries are the one dying by disease, not the other way around. So much so that of the 376 Jesuits who went to China between 1580 and 1712, 127 of them died on the boat before they even got there. It was a dangerous thing to do, all right? In the East, primarily we're talking right now about the Jesuits, they faced cultures that were confident, that didn't believe, and religions that had been there for thousands of years. When you couldn't conquer them with a gun, they didn't see any reason why they should listen to you. The Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucian, those following Confucius, they're like, what do you guys got to teach us, right? They considered them to be uncultured, to be backwoods kind of thing. In China, the Jesuits decided to adopt Confucian dress like a Confucian wise man, sort of blend with with what's going on there. In India, and they had some success with that, but in India, when they tried to convert the locals, they ran into a barrier that still exists to this day. If you leave Hinduism, you lose your caste. And if you're not on the bottom of the caste system, that's a dangerous thing. However, this early work was done by the Jesuits, and I didn't mention Francis Xavier. He accepted the idea that these faiths that already existed could have a reflected truth from God. Not that they were true with a capital T, but that they could have some truth in them. And then so we could talk with them, we could learn from them, see what's true, accommodate what's true, right? And have some sort of dialogue and debate. That was Xavier's attitude, but it's not going to last because when the Dominicans and the Franciscans arrive in China and the Philippines, they will attack the Jesuit policy and say, this is not the Christian way to do this. We condemn them. Eventually, the Pope is going to take their side and say, you Jesuits were going too far in trying to understand the local culture and the local customs. Just to give you a little anecdote, at the height of the success that the Jesuits found in China at the end of the 17th century, they had 75 priests there. That's not bad, but that was serving 250,000 converts. 75 or 250,000 is a tough ratio. So it leads to an important question in missions. Are what we're doing in missions, is that working with the local culture or against the local culture? The Jesuits said, we can work with it. The Franciscans and the Dominicans said, no, we need to replace it. So are missionaries sharing a Western European gospel or just a gospel that can be applied to any culture? It's an age-old question and a debate that the Protestants had the same debate just later. The idea of melding the two together, of you take the gospel with Chinese culture and language and bring them together, or the gospel with Burmese culture and language or whatever, that's called syncretism. that you can take the best of what they've got and meld it with the gospel. The Dominicans and the Franciscans said, no, you've got to replace it. So it's kind of against the culture. It's much more antagonistic. In 1773, the Pope suppressed the Jesuits, basically shut them down. And so that era of Catholic missions didn't come to a complete halt, but it had lost most of its momentum with the end of the Jesuits. But this is a question that goes all the way back to the beginning, right? Because we have a Greek-flavored church in the East. We have a Roman-flavored church in the West. And it's not a new idea that we have to decide what can we keep from the language and the culture and the philosophy that we find. All right, a couple more things, and then we'll get to the Protestants here. Japan. In 1549, Francis Xavier and the Jesuits arrived. They had huge success, 300,000 converts by the end of the century. In 1593, unfortunately, the Franciscans arrived, and they came with an attitude that was insulting towards Japanese culture, and they got themselves crucified for it. And eventually all the Europeans were thrown out of Japan. The Tokugawa dynasty, when it established itself, had a very negative attitude towards foreign things, not just European things, but Chinese things, anything foreign. And they began a widespread and savage persecution of the Christians in Japan, one of the most savage persecutions in Christian history anywhere. So much so that they basically wiped out the whole community. There was very little left. And you might have heard someone say that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Probably heard somebody say that. Japan is the cautionary tale that says, are you really sure about that? Maybe martyrdom leads to some good things in some cases, but if the persecution is strong enough and aggressive enough and maintained long enough, you just end up getting everybody killed. The Soviets did a very similar thing, of course, in parts of their territory they controlled. So the story in Japan does not end well at all. All right, Protestants want to get in on this at some point. Now, the reason they were not involved in the first couple of centuries is that Protestantism was, number one, trying to figure out what it was, and number two, trying to survive. But eventually they join in this. Roger Williams, we know about him here in the Americas. He was one of the few colonists amongst the early American colonists who decided that it was important to share the gospel with the native tribes. He translated, I'm jumping down to John Eliot. John Eliot in 1633 is the first one to print a Bible in North America. That Bible happened to be in Algonquin. He translated it himself into Algonquin. He had thousands of converts. But in North America, the story is going to end the same way. The conflict and the military fight between the Native Americans and the colonists is going to destroy any missionary work, right? Hard to share the gospel with the people that you're trying to push out of their land and wipe out. So that's certainly, we know the way that story ends up going. The thing that changes for Protestants, much of this, is the abolition movement. You have a spate of missionary societies founded between 1701 and the end of the century. Anglican societies, Baptist societies, Methodist societies, everybody's forming a mission society. So there's really a big push for mission society. Let me give you a couple of examples. In 1735, Charles and John Wesley come to the United States. Well, not to the United States, but they come to Georgia. And it doesn't go well for them at all. But they were there as part of the propagation of the Gospel Society from Anglican Church in England. They went back home, and there is where, of course, John Wesley has his conversion experience, where he begins being an open-air preacher along with George Whitefield. and begins the beginning of what will become in the United States, in America, the Great Awakening. Not that that's necessarily part of the worldwide missions movement, but is an important part of the story. Of course, of course, the Wesleys were again influenced by the Moravians. It goes all the way back to Wycliffe. So it started with an Englishman, and now it's coming all the way back around to an Englishman. You have John Newton joining the abolitionists. We know John Newton, of course, because of Amazing Grace. The Pennsylvania Quakers were the first corporate body to say that slavery in any kind should be outlawed. No slaves at all. And the Pennsylvania Quakers, yay, Pennsylvania, way back in 1758 were the first ones to pass that kind of resolution. William Wilberforce in England will spend decades fighting to outlaw slavery in the British Empire. The final victory in Parliament of the bill to outlaw it will be passed only 3 days before he died. So at least he saw the end of that victory. It was an interesting coalition. There were evangelicals as abolitionists and Unitarians. They're not going to see eye to eye on much, but they were both anti-slavery. In 1839, Pope Gregory XVI will condemn the slave trade as well. So you have this idea of the dignity of other peoples, of course, and that feeds into the missions movement, the idea that when we take the gospel, it's not to an inferior people or to people that ought to be enslaved. But of course, the legacy of slavery will be what many of the missionaries are fighting against in parts of the world. Let's look at just a couple of quick places. In the early 19th century, if you were to say, what is the future of Africa? People would have thought it was going to become an entire Muslim continent. Islam was spreading, it was advancing, but Protestant missionaries had been doing work in West Africa for some time, and because of the trade network, when white men first came to the interior of Africa and shared gospel stories, they kept finding people that knew what they were talking about, because locals had spread stories, and so they knew bits and pieces of it. So the seeds were sown ahead of time by these trade networks and by farmers that were migrant. One of the things that they did that was effective was working with lay leaders, was emphasizing local native workers and converts as being an important part of the story. They continued, unlike the Catholics who were fighting over celibacy, right, and trying to get people to understand celibacy, in Africa, the Protestants were trying to get the locals to give up polygamy. They, of course, had an issue because they'd say, well, Abraham had more than one wife, Jacob had more than one wife, and the missionaries were like, shoot, right, getting people to read the Bible, that's what happens. All right, let me push on here. I got more to say, but I'm running on fumes on my voice. India and China, two important people to talk about in the history of Protestant missions here. Number one, you've got William Carey, who was both a minister and a translator. In 1793, he arrived in India, translated the Bible into 6 different Indian languages. That's an effort. That's an amazing language skill. He's the one that famously said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. It's an awesome slogan. But he didn't have mass success in India. Nobody's had mass success in India. The caste system is such a barrier. And then we have Hudson Taylor, who in 1865 founds China Inland Mission. Very different than a lot of other people. Number one, he put his base of operations in China, not in Europe or in America. And he didn't go to Europe or in America seeking money. He ran things from there. He had his missionaries dressed like Chinese. He had their children educated in China. The standard operating procedure throughout all of this time period was to send your kids back to Europe for education because it wasn't safe and you couldn't educate them there. He said, no, keep your kids here. He spent 51 years in China, brought 800 missionaries there. They founded 125 schools, had 18,000 converts. One of the revolutionary things that he did was he was willing to accept missionaries from any Protestant denomination. He was ecumenical in a time when people didn't even use the word ecumenical. And even more radical, he let single women be missionaries. Come on over, he said. We'll put you to work. 800 missionaries during his lifetime. They set up 300 different stations scattered throughout the country. An amazing work by Hudson Taylor, the work of one man there. In 1853, Japan is reopened to outsiders. You guys know about Commodore Perry and the what they called the Great White Fleet and the modern battleships. The Japanese said, we got to learn from these Europeans because they're ahead of us. And despite the fact that new missionaries came to China and lots of Christian literature in Japanese, Christianity hasn't returned to Japan. It's still like a 2% kind of minority. So it's just a sad thing that didn't work. However, in Korea, you have the opposite kind of thing. You have a man named Yi Sung-hung, who was a native Korean. He was serving as a diplomat in Beijing, where he converted to Catholicism. He went back to Korea, and he himself helped gain 10,000 converts from 1784 to 1801, and he only had one Chinese priest helping him. So the two of them, 10,000 converts. But then persecution began, and no priests were allowed to come into the country till 1833. By the 1870s, after that spat of persecution, Protestants were now in, along with the Catholics, and they said, we got to emphasize the local laity. And that was a good thing, because when the Japanese invaded prior to World War II, of course, the Europeans were forced to leave, and the church had to rely upon just the native Koreans. Throughout the Japanese occupation, the Korean Christians, because of their persecution, because of their defiance of the Japanese, they were seen as heroes of Korea, not as foreign interlopers, right? Not as colonialists. They were fighting against the colonizers. Because in most of these stories, the missionaries, whether it's in South America or Africa or whatever, are going against the reputation of the colonials, right? Of the people that are there just for the money. They've got to fight against that. Whereas in Korea, they're on the side for independence. And so after World War II, Christianity in Korea explodes, and the numbers there are now huge. All right. Any question on the modern missions movement? We just got about 10 minutes on the church today before we wrap it up. Okay. I got to hit the home stretch here. Just a map to get us started. Islam, Christianity around the sides there, Hinduism, Buddhism, and this is kind of other because of the official atheist policies. There's more Hinduism or more Islam there. Where are we at? A couple of things just to bring us up to the modern era. Got to say a word about World War I. Remember we were talking about the 30 Years' War and how religion was part of it? You can forget that by World War I. All right? During the 30 Years' War, France said, we're not going to stick to our own side. We got to fight for survival, right? They switched sides. You see that more and more as history moves forward. You see people siding with the Ottomans, with the Muslims. Well, we'll ally with them against the Russians or against the French or against whoever. And then by the time World War I rolls around, look at this lineup. You got Anglican England with anti-clerical France right after the French Revolution. They're basically anti-religion. And Orthodox Russia fighting against Lutheran Germany, Catholic Austria, and Muslim Ottomans. Hey, it's not about religion. Nobody cares, right? It's about nationalism, not about religion at all. Pope Benedict XV tried to negotiate a peace in 1917. Nobody listened to him. Nobody cared. All right, so that's a change between people fighting because, at least partly because of religion, to nationalism and your ethnic group and whatever, your language group being the thing that's far more important. World War II sees a period where, of course, the struggles against communism, fascism, and genocide put the church under great strain. A few examples. 1915 to 1916, you have 1 million Armenian Christians killed during World War I by the Ottoman Turks. In 1917, the Tsar's government in Russia falls, and you have 70 years of anti-religious rule by the communists in Russia and eventually in Eastern Europe, officially anti-religion. They had some accommodation with the Orthodox Church, but they were pretty hard on the church throughout. In the 30s, in the Spanish Civil War, 115 out of 240 priests were killed in one diocese. Okay. Another example of some of the issues that were happening during this time period, of course, Pope Pius XII has been criticized ever since World War II because he was, quote unquote, silent about the Holocaust. It's more complicated than that. But obviously the Nazis showed us just how deep anti-Semitism was in Christian Europe. In the heart of Luther's Reformation, you have people willing to murder Jews like that. It asks a question that we don't have very good answers to. How can such evil happen in the heart of Christendom? That is a brutal question. You have some that showed themselves to be heroes during that time period, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, men like Karl Barth, who went against the Nazis. But by and large, you have people going with the flow. Whether it's communism or fascism, you don't see, it's not a good time for the church. So much so that at the end of World War II, Christianity in Europe was weaker than any time since the Middle Ages. And it has remained weak ever since because of the failure of World War I and World War II. But on contrast, in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia, both Protestantism and Catholicism have been flourishing since World War II. We've got some new developments like Pentecostalism, right? The Word of Faith movement, the prosperity gospel, new things coming, new ideas, like them or not, that have influenced things. Pentecostalism is now huge in Central and South America. Those places were 85, 90, 95% Catholic, but now they're 5, 10, 15% Pentecostal as well. Vatican II, we got to say a couple words about Vatican II. In 1962, 2,000 bishops came to Rome for this council. More than half of them were not from Europe. It's a change in the epicenter of the church away from Europe. There were a couple of huge developments. Number one, you have the Pope saying that the Church of Christ doesn't simply equal the Church of the Pope. In other words, the Catholic Church admitting that the church that belongs to Jesus is not synonymous with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is part of that, but there are parts beyond the Catholic Church that are also part of the Church of Jesus Christ. That is a huge change in attitude from counter-Reformation times. You also have, of course, the change of the liturgy into the vernacular. Overnight, the Latin Tridentan Mass, the thing that was the hallmark of the Counter-Reformation, gone. Of course, you have to this day some Catholics that are still upset about that. Give it another decade and those guys won't be with us anymore, and it'll be old news. And they also became open to the idea of ecumenism, the idea that, of course, the church could exist in areas beyond just Catholicism. Two other quick developments. Number one was an apology to the Jewish people, which basically every church owes, Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic. And also, whether people thought maybe they were going in this direction, but they didn't, priestly celibacy was affirmed and birth control was banned. Those issues are coming back. If you pay attention to the news, there's a lot of debate and a lot of talk about whether or not Pope Francis is going to open up some areas of the world to married priests, and that might be happening in our lifetimes. Couple other quick things. You have a new focus on third world poverty. You have the combination, at least especially during the Cold War, of socialist ideology and Christian teaching about poverty. You have people like John Paul II saying the gospel has a preferential option for the poor. In other words, the gospel favors the poor. which we already knew that because Jesus had a thing or two to say about rich men in the kingdom of heaven, right? We knew that. You have the story of apartheid in South Africa, which is both the best and worst of the church, because you have the Dutch Reformed Church supporting apartheid, but you have other churches, in particular the Anglican Church, supporting the African National Congress. In the end, thankfully, Archbishop Desmond Tutu called for healing after apartheid fell instead of revenge, because that could have been a bloody mess. But they chose him, and of course Nelson Mandela chose peace instead of war there. At the same time, you have the civil rights movement in America, Martin Luther King Jr., a lot of stuff happening. And I chose purposely not to spend any time talking about the culture wars in America. We've had that up to here, so you all know about that. So let me just give you some statistics to finish it off. We've been on a 2,000-year journey. Let's find out where we stand today as a church, and then we'll wrap it up. We're just a minute or two from the end. In 1900, so just over 100 years ago, 21% of the world's Christians were Orthodox. That number's down to 11%. In part because of war, World War II, killing so many Russians, and other things of that nature, but also because Catholicism and Protestantism have grown. All right, Roman Catholics went from 48% to 52%, but Protestants are now up to, along with other, right, Pentecostals, Protestants, however you'd call the other, everybody that ain't Orthodox and Catholic is now up to 37%. So Orthodox are now kind of in third in that respect among Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. In China and India, the estimates are now that there are 120 million Christians, which makes them 6% of the world's populations. If the Chinese and Indian Christians were their own religion, they'd be the world's 5th largest religion. That's telling us that the epicenter of Christianity is shifting away from Europe and North America to the south, to Africa, Asia, and South America. That's where the vast majority of the growth in the 21st century is happening. That's where where the leaders of the church in the next few generations, the pull of the church is going to be in that direction. As of 2009, the most up-to-date statistics I could find, the world has about 2 billion Christians, which means 1/3. That's 4 times what it was in 1900. Now, of course, a lot of that has to do with there's a lot more people on the planet than in 1900, but also with explosive growth in Africa and Asia. I keep hearing people talking about how Islam will be the world's largest religion at some point. They've got about 500 million people to make up if they're going to do that. That's a significant gap. And the author, Diarmaid MacCulloch, ends his book by saying, most of Christianity's problems at the beginning of the 21st century are problems of success. How do we deal with wealth? How do we deal with modernity? But not problems of persecution, not problems of, like what our ancestors had. So it's a very different attitude, a much more positive. I kind of wanted to leave it with a positive note because I think the statistics, and I think if we are willing to look at this from a Christian worldview, which says that we count an Indian and a Chinese and an African Christian as equally as a white Christian, as an American Christian, as a European Christian, then the story is a positive story. If we think of Christians like us as counting for 2 or 3 of them, then we have reason to be afraid. But that's not the way Christ looks at his church. So it's a positive story. I'll just end you with 2 maps. Here's the world's population by size. A lot of people in India and China, right? That is those 120 million. It's a minority in those 2 countries, but it's a real big piece. It's a big piece of a huge pie. You've got vast majority of Christians in these societies in southern Africa and in Europe still. Even though you hear about the death of Christianity in Europe and churches being empty, there's still a lot of people that call themselves Christians. The story's not over there. It's just having a hard time. And then this one. hear a lot of people talking about the decline of the church in the United States. This goes between 2010 and 2050 in terms of projections. Christians going from 78% to 66%. For all the sky is falling talk that you hear, for all the people saying the Muslims are going to take over and are going to institute jihad or Sharia law. Look at the number. 2.1% is the projection in 2050. I don't see that happening. All right? The group that's growing, of course, is the nuns, the people that, N-O-N-Es, the people that don't go to church or synagogue or mosque or anything. But even those projections for 2050, which is still more than 30 years away, have Christians as the majority, depending on how you want to, of course, define that. So that'll bring our journey to a close. Any final questions? Because I got a sentence or two left before my voice is completely gone. All right. Thanks for coming. Thanks for putting up with it.